This is Rockall7 and you're watching a history of cultural impacts. Hello, observer. Are you curious on how the 70s were aside the movements, politics, and Jane Fonda's infamous baby killers vote on returning Vietnam soldiers? Well, here's an interview to the Groovy 70's. As it started, mostly jazz had dominion over the television and radio, but at the same time, disco made itself noticed. Classic rock, psychedelic rock, and much of their offshoot genres continued in this decade. This decade also had John Travolta's famous Saturday Night Fever, which highlighted the cultural impact of the decade. Video games were also introduced in this decade, as was techno music and hip-hop. The term funky was made famous in this decade. Also introduced by this decade was the first skateboards as well as some early skating tricks. It was also the time of economic recession, but that didn't bother culture, nor will it ever. Deep Purple moved forward boldly with hard rock, bringing in the hard rock scene that was barely noticed, but still famous. Sitcom shows stayed oriented towards families, but suddenly shifted to military and otherwise neighborhood situations. Science fiction started to stagger in this decade, but made a strong comeback with George Lucas's Star Wars, which made a massive change to the theater, creating the silver screen cinema aspect of pop culture. Furthermore, was some flashy, colorful, and bright fashions introduced by the disco dance. Bruce Lee became a famous martial artist who acted in various martial arts and Asian-based action films, making China's and Japan's films recognized and popular. This decade was full of exciting things, and that's saying a lot. In this decade came game shows, which was introduced through variety shows of the same decade. Westerns pretty much ended by this decade, giving room to newer major genres such as science fiction, fantasy, horror, and action films. This was a decade when James Bond was still a tough, hot-smoking agent who knew how to whoop ass on bad dudes. The rise of epics came as the cinematic era began. A major film that broke the mold of radio speaker and wall displays of films, creating a groundbreaking cinema with exploding vast speakers and white wall for major films. Jaws being the film that scared people out of water for some years, introduced blockbusters. Saturday Night Fever was one of John Travolta's first films that highlighted the disco decade. Mafia-style crime films was continued through The Godfather as The Exorcist gave way to popular horror films. Well, I have to say, one large decade at the movies. The major fashion sense of the decade was the disco look, which featured the froze, the white jumpsuit, the luxury chain, the new dress shoes and go-go boots, including Nancy Sinatra's staying power of shirt skirt. On the sides was the hard rock fashion of jeans and wide beaters, schoolboy outfit or shorts, bomber vest and t-shirt with frizzy long hair, and tennis shoes. And at the end of the decade came punk fashion, which featured raggedy jeans, modified vest and raggedy shirt, as well as skater shoes. The mohawk had yet to appear. Video games started out as the Atari fame of Pac-Man, Pong, Space Invaders, Asteroids, and Tetris. Video game consoles as Magnavox Odyssey were introduced in this era, though they generally needed a computer to work. The first personal computers were also introduced by this decade, who have no relevance to us since they were MOS-DOS-based things. Major shows such as Charlie's Angels, MASH, and the Brady Bunch became big on television, which also happened at the time of the introduction to the mainstream media. Don't forget Foxy Brown, but overall, this decade has some interesting entertainment. The major pop culture and other cultural introductions weren't the last things about the decade. There may have not been any new comics or superheroes, but There were certainly new cartoons, music genres, toys, and more. Schoolhouse rock were big parts of the 70s, having much staying power on children even today. Others were Rocky Bullwinkle, Wonder Woman, and the cartoon rock band Josie and the Pussycats. Though less recognized and popular, Hank the Cheese Man preceded SpongeBob and Invader Zim. Hanna-Barbera's era of cartoons had not yet faded away. Disney continued to make fresh and original cartoon films. As for the musical world, that became the big pop culture by the 80s all the way to the 2000s. In this decade, hard rock was a major scene which was founded by Deep Purple and made recognized by metalhead forefather Alice Cooper and made famous by AC/DC. This caused the creation of the Hard Rock Cafe dedicated to hard rock music that became big in the early 70s. Even as disco dominated pop culture and mainstream influence, by the late 70s, the first rockaholic scene, punk rock, which was made famous by The Clash and made appealing by the Sex Pistols, and expanded rock and roll to newer heights, being less industrial, less slow, and less droning on the guitar by giving it speed, high noise levels, and being countercultural in a major aspect. The toys of the decade were pretty major as well. The Hoppers, which introduced rubber bouncing balls, was a girl toy, as was the hula hoops. For boys, there was plenty, such as the introduction of Hot Wheel toy cars, the fun Rock'em robot boxing toy, fan toys to pay honor to major pop culture successes, and lastly, skateboards for young and older teens to enjoy the outdoors. The disco ball is a major artifact that made disco a huge matter in pop culture. Stephen King also became a major popular novel writer during the decade, giving the theme of horror a new definition. Elton John was a big pop music performer. Patti Smith became a huge first on female rock performers. Kenny Rogers became the biggest name in country music. Kylie Minogue was the first of all divas. Bob Marley became an important figure on rock music. Pink Floyd was one of the most enjoyable performers in rock. James Earl Jones made himself famous by voicing Darth Vader in the phenomenon Star Wars, and George Lucas brought in an era of epics and pop culture genres. There was also the cool cars known as lowriders. Beyond all this was a colorful and shiny decade that made the cyber thing exciting.
Honey, honey, let me feel it. Honey, honey. Honey, honey, don't conceal it. Honey, honey. The way that you kiss goodnight, the way that you hold me tight, I feel like I wanna sing when you do.
Well, I gotta say, quite a bold move from the old industrial era to a new modern era, where studio production was the new deal. This is it for the 70s. Now, in my next video, we shall see the 80s at a glance. Later, sly thing.